As Greg Mills suggests, that there is always a huge divergence between policies that align with national interests and the interests of African politicians. Because of this, many policies in Africa, initially purported to serve national interests, have been subverted and manipulated by politicians in power. So I believe that we need to ask questions of sanity. Why has the agricultural output in Africa declined? Why have our policy choices been so poor? And why are we so dependent on the international donor communities to an extent that a sizable chunk of our government's budget comprises of international aid? And most importantly, why is our record of democracy and human rights so atrocious? I think when we put the answers to the above questions to measurable numbers and indicators such as infant mortality, life expectancy, living standards, income levels, and population growth, questions like these being asked becomes very important because the plight of Africans is a dire one. On the other hand, we just don't have opportunities to find work or to start and grow businesses. Population-wise, we've got so many young people in Africa shouldering the biggest chunk of the unemployment crisis, and my country, South Africa, is not spared from this sad reality. We've also got poor governance and out-of-hand levels of graft across many government sectors. Let us set the record straight with international aid. It doesn't build nations. Even those nations that are endowing much of Africa with handouts did not develop through handouts. The growth of their economies hinged upon supply-side means. You can double down on international aid, but policies matter and carry more weight in determining the country's economic directions and fortunes. Policies that matter, which see a country's trajectory of economic betterment, focus on enforcing contracts, rule of law, and property rights. Equally important is the formulation of policies that encourage business startups. Entrepreneurs must be sustained and given markets for them to expand. Let us take South Africa, for example. Ever since we emerged from apartheid in 1994, there hasn't been a major city created from scratch that would eventually reach the status of Cape Town, Johannesburg, or Durban. My village, Nongoma, entered the post-apartheid era in a state of technological backwardness and low levels of educational attainment. 30 years later, Nongoma hasn't begun the process of modernization in its matters. How did China grow with its convergence with many first world countries? By modernizing. Few regions in China remain rural. Even those that have remained rural regularly see themselves being recipients of big federal projects and public works such as bridge constructions cutting through them. Whatever policies the South African government has in place, they don't support incentives that make people save, invest, and innovate. Instead, our policies have supported extractive institutions such as the ANC itself and unworthy rural chieftaincies. ANC officials have been feeding from the tax trap through graft and malfeasance. The Limpopo government bought rural chiefs numerous vehicles worth tens of millions of rands. The question is, what sort of meaningful economic activity will be derived from such spending of the taxpayers' money? Most institutions that have power in Africa are exclusionist and extractive. Common Africans who have talent, vision, and intelligence that will be highly rewarded if they were born in inclusive nations, such as those in North America or Scandinavia, are sidelined and cannot contribute their ingenuity in building their countries or economies. Therefore, we need to break this iron mold and make drastic steps toward building inclusive institutions. If African leaders do not formulate policies that will endow people of extraordinary talents and entrepreneurial spirit with incentives and markets for them to test their products, the brain drain will continue. While still breaking this iron mold, we need to mount increasing criticism on many African leaders so that they are aware of our collective consciousness about their ineptitude, which will lead to them to either reforming their ways of leadership or being ousted and replaced with leaders more responsive to African needs. In South Africa, I think that we are fortunate that we have a relatively free press, and that means that the ANC is now aware of their own increasing inability to hold themselves into a positive relationship with South African voters, and this is demonstrated by low voter turnout rates and their approval rates being at a historic low. Let us hypothetically remove South Africa as a setting upon which the ANC is embedded and replace it with North American or Scandinavian countries. The ANC would have been long gone if such was a scenario. The ANC's failings are too blatant for the North Americans or Scandinavians to not react by voting them out. And I believe that the ANC's failings began more than a decade ago, but they still have been able to hold themselves into power because their voter base is not socially conscious and has been subjected to education of squalid conditions. On the contrary, Scandinavian citizens are better educated, meaning that they can swiftly react against any government incompetence with the backing of constitutionally enshrined democratic rights and well-functioning democracies in the process. Therefore, it is in the best interest of the ANC to lower the standards of education and keep our schools in squalid conditions because that guarantees the continuance of their rule. South African democracy is flawed, caused by violent political infighting, notably in KZN, the assassination of whistleblowers, and the attacks on the independence of our judiciaries and legislatures by South African politicians. I'm a staunch proponent of solving South Africa's socio-economic issues by resorting to outsiders, but that is possible only after we have admitted or conceded that local solutions have failed. Cultural borrowings and emulating outsiders and emulating development strategies of other countries isn't a bad thing to do. Looking to Western jurisdictions and perhaps Scandinavia as useful case studies when seeking to improve our democracies and placing time limits on African presidents is a genuine policy suggestion. African leaders ruling for indefinite terms, exercising unchecked powers, oftentimes undemocratically, which almost always result in human rights encroachments. Has it worked for Africans? African leaders care more about maintaining tight grips on power, fanning the flames of civil conflicts in the name of power struggles or liberation. All of this amounts to bad governance, but there's no political will to reverse engineer the circumstances and tend toward good governance encapsulated by greater democracies and economic freedoms. I think this will also necessitate the input of outsider countries, those ranking high up in the list of many critical socio-economic indicators shared by the World Bank. The issue of African development on a standstill is explained by a confluence of factors, including very sparse road density, which raises transport costs and infrastructure backlog. In South Africa, for example, rail networks have been decimated by the government's ineptitude. It's not that we as Africans don't work hard, it's the productivity and value that is derived from such work that is low compared to global averages. Low productivity is most visible in the type of skills that we possess, the quality of education, and in post-independence leadership. Post-independence leaders who hold the extent of power that makes or breaks a nation don't exercise it in a manner that they have internalized values of high regard for their constituents. They know that consequences for engaging in corrupt activities and human rights atrocities are severely overmatched by the benefit. For a country existing under such political conditions, it's hard to imagine why poverty, environmental degradation, and lack of investment in infrastructure and education wouldn't be normal. African presidents hold dangerously insane amounts of unchecked power. They can rewrite and bend constitutions, cling to power for longer than they should. They can throw out due process and ultimately suspend parliament. This is unheard of in many first world countries, and it is what impoverishes the African continent.